Thank you for the opportunity to speak here. Can you hear me at the back okay? The mics are okay? Great. So the subject of my talk today will be the relationship of stress and illness and health. And the work is based on my experience as a family physician in Vancouver, British Columbia, which I did for about 20 years, for 7 years of which I was also the medical coordinator of the palliative care unit at Vancouver Hospital, which is a in-hospital hospice facility for the terminally ill. And hence, both in family practice and in this end-of-life stage, I had the opportunity to witness who got sick and who didn't. And what struck me inexorably after observing this for a number of years is that illness wasn't accidental, that it isn't random, that the medical perspective in which I was trained and which is still dominant, that we just don't know what causes most illnesses, is only so because we're not looking at what really matters. And that has to do with a deep split in Western thinking, which separates the mind from the body and which separates the individual from the environment. But if we actually understand an individual illness as the manifestation of a life, and that life as the manifestation of existence within a culture and a certain environment, then we understand that the manifestation of illness in an individual actually represents a cultural, societal, and multi-generational experience focused in one particular individual. That may not be apparent to you just yet, but I trust it will be by the end of my talk. Now, I often give this talk and I begin with some obituaries, which I haven't brought with me today, or newspaper clippings, I should say, mostly obituaries, which I haven't brought with me today, but having given the talk often enough, I can pretty much recollect them by heart, so I will cite them for you. These are newspaper clippings from a major Canadian newspaper called the Globe and Mail, where I used to be medical columnist for a few years back in the 1990s. And the first article was written in a first-person account by a woman whose name is Donna, who's diagnosed with breast cancer, and her doctor's name is Harold, and her husband's name is Hai. And she's writing about her diagnosis with breast cancer. Now Hai, her husband, had been married previously, and his first wife died of breast cancer. Now Donna, the second wife, is diagnosed with it. And Donna writes, Harold, the doctor, then tells me that the lump is small and most assuredly not in my lymph nodes, unlike that of Hai's first wife. You will not die, he assures me. But I'm worried about Hai, I say. I won't have the strength to support him. Now what do you notice? Anybody?
Codependency.
Well, if you didn't phrase it in clinical terms, which is, I mean, you're right, but what does that actually mean? What do you actually notice as a behavior or as a dynamic?
It's focusing on her husband.
Yeah, so she's focusing on the needs of the emotion. So this compulsive regard for the emotional needs of other people while ignoring your own. I mean, she's the one that's going to go through an experience of chemotherapy, radiation, surgery, perhaps. Difficult time, and her focus is, how will I support my husband? So this compulsive regard for the needs of others while ignoring your own is a major risk factor for illness of all kinds, and particularly cancer. And very often breast cancer, as a matter of fact. Why that should be the case, I will hope to elucidate for you. The other articles I'm going to quote are obituaries. And obituaries are fascinating because they tell us not only about the person who dies, but also about what we value in one another in a society. And you've heard the expression, the good die young. Well, the fact is they do die young, and there's a reason for it. And what we celebrate in each other is very often the qualities that kill us. So the first obituary is a 55-year-old physician in Toronto, Ontario. It said about him, after his diagnosis with cancer, never for a day did he contemplate giving up the work he so loved at Sick Children's Hospital in Toronto. He continued his duties throughout his year-long battle with cancer, stopping only a few days before he died. So what you got here is this rigid identification with duty, role, and responsibility rather than the needs of the self. I mean, if a friend of yours was diagnosed with a potential terminal illness and was going to go through again a difficult course of treatment, would you advise them, here buddy, here's what you do, don't even take a day for yourself, just go back to work. And all the time that you're struggling with chemotherapy and the side effects of that and radiation, whatever's happening to you, just keep working. So again, that identification with your role and your responsibility and your duties is a major risk factor for illness for reasons that I will get to. The second obituary I'll cite for you, a woman called Naomi, died age 55, also of breast cancer. And it was her appreciative husband who wrote the following. In her entire life, Naomi never going to fight with anyone. The harshest thing she could say was "fooey" or something else along those lines. She just blended in with the environment. She had no ego. She just blended in with the environment in an unassuming manner. And sometimes you may wish that your spouse and partner blended in with the environment in an unassuming manner, but that difficulty, what is really being said about that woman is she didn't know how to be angry in a healthy way. And there's such a thing as healthy anger, there's also such a thing as unhealthy anger. And I hope to make that distinction for you later, but people that don't know how to experience and manifest healthy aggression are more likely to die for the very simple reason that the suppression of anger also suppresses your immune system, as I will tell you. And it's a major characteristic of people who develop chronic illness. And when I say chronic illness, I mean cancer, I mean multiple sclerosis, ALS, rheumatoid arthritis, any autoimmune disease, colitis, Crohn's disease, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, anything you care to name. Chronic eczema, psoriasis, asthma, any chronic illness. And you think, what do all these illnesses have in common? A lot, actually, a lot. Finally, I'll just cite you one more obituary that's almost difficult to believe had it not been printed in a major national newspaper. I forget the guy's name, but he was also a doctor who died of cancer in his 70s this time. And the obituary said that he and his mother had an incredibly special relationship, a bond that was apparent in all aspects of his life. As a married, his name was Sidney. As a married man with young children, Sidney would have dinner with his parents every day, and then he would go home to his family, greeted by his 4 children and his wife Rosalind, and yet another dinner to eat and to enjoy. Sidney kept eating 2 dinners a day for years until gradual weight gain began to raise suspicions. This poor man suffered from 2 beliefs. One is that he's responsible for how other people feel, number 1, and number 2, that he must never disappoint anybody. So he could not say either to his wife, to his mother, look, to his mother, you know, Mom, I got astonishing news, I'm married with 4 kids. So that means that much of the time I'll be having dinner with them. And nor could he say to his wife that, look, you know, Rosalind, my mother needs me, once or twice a week, I'm going to have dinner with her. This compulsive desire to please everybody is a major risk factor. It's a killer, as a matter of fact, for reasons I explained. And if I get to those reasons, let me give you the illustration of one particular illness that I've studied with great interest, because to me it just epitomizes the dynamics that I'm talking about. And that's an illness that, again, my profession says we don't know what causes it, and yet I think we don't know what causes it only because we're not looking. It's ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, a degenerative disease of the nervous system that leaves you mentally intact, but paralyzed because of the degeneration of the nerves that move the muscles in the trunk. In the end, you're paralyzed, and even your breathing muscles no longer work, and you literally die of respiratory failure. and it's a uniformly fatal diagnosis, almost uniformly, I should say. And usually death ensues well within 10 years, and sometimes much faster after diagnosis, except, because there are exceptions, you get somebody like Stephen Hawking, the physicist, the famous physicist, who was diagnosed with at age 21 or age 20. He was given 1 year to live, and that was over 50 years ago. He's still alive, which is to say that maybe we don't know everything that should be known. Well, a woman came to me for a second opinion, I think about 12 years ago now. She'd been diagnosed with ALS, but she, and in particular her husband, having heard about my interest in stress, wanted to know from me that no, it wasn't ALS at all, it was only stress, and that could be dealt with that way. Turned out to be ALS. And he should be diagnosed by a leading international expert, and there was no question about the diagnosis, but it was also stress. The patient was a elementary school teacher and principal in the Vancouver area, and when I began to listen to her, the story that emerged was that she first began to notice that she couldn't hold the pen or the chalk in her hands because the fingers just wouldn't close properly. And she also began to experience difficulty walking. Nor could she hold the chalk to write on the blackboard anymore very well. What she did, now of course if that began to happen to you, I would think that most of you would immediately seek some kind of attention, some kind of assessment as to what's going on. Not her. What she did was she'd get up every morning at 5 in the morning because of course it being her clumsiness and impairment of movement, it took her a long time to get dressed. She had to get up at 5 o'clock every morning, get ready, drive herself to school, so she could be there by 7:30, so she could, with her slow gait, hobble into the classroom, and clutching the chalk in her clenched fist, she would scrawl the day's lesson on the board for the students. And then she'd go home at night and stay up late preparing the next day's lesson and repeat the routine the next morning. And she did this for months until she could no longer walk, and at that point she finally went to see a doctor. And that's how the diagnosis happened. Now, that may not be interesting in itself, except that it's completely typical of everybody with ALS. You're not going to find, you're not going to read about, you're not going to meet anybody with ALS who does not fit that profile. And I've never, ever, ever, even by accident, run across anybody who didn't. Interestingly enough, in writing this book, and this lecture of mine is based on my book, When the Body Says No, Exploring the Stress-Disease Connection, and I understand that there might be some copies of it here. Interestingly enough, American publishers like to play around with my subtitles, usually not to the book's benefit at all. The Canadian subtitle was not exploring the stress-disease connection, but the cost of hidden stress. Because these stresses are stresses that are unconscious and people are not aware of them. In any case, in assembling the material for this book, I did basically, I followed 3 trajectories. I collected case histories from my own files, and I interviewed about 100 people or more with different illnesses. Number 1. Number 2, I looked up the biographies of famous people who had been diagnosed with a certain illness, like in the United States, it's called Lou Gehrig's disease. So I looked at the biography of Lou Gehrig, and I'll tell you about Lou Gehrig in a minute, the famous baseball player. And I looked at the medical literature. And sometimes there was a lot, and sometimes there wasn't a lot at all. But in the case of ALS, I found one study that had been done at Yale University Medical School. 2 psychiatrists looked at a number of ALS patients, and listened to their conclusion. These patients, invariably evoked admiration and respect from all staff who came into contact with them. Characteristic was their attempt to avoid asking for help. Hard, steady work without recourse to help from others was pervasive, and there seemed to have been habitual denial, suppression, or isolation of fear, anxiety, and sadness, and I would add anger as well, and most expressed the necessity to be cheerful. Some spoke casually of their deterioration, or did so with engaging smiles. Then I ran across a paper presented at the International ALS Congress in Munich, Germany, by 2 neurologists from the Cleveland Clinic in Ohio, when people come to the Cleveland, this paper was called "Why Are Patients with ALS So Nice?" This wasn't a study. This wasn't a study. It was just an observation. The observation was that when people come to the Cleveland Clinic for diagnosis, before they see the neurologist, they undergo what's called EDX, electrodiagnostic testing, which assesses the state of the nerves that supply the arms. The technicians who perform the test will predict who will get ALS and who won't, based on how nice the person is. And so the neurologist reported in this paper in Munich that these technicians will accompany the work with a comment like, "This patient cannot have ALS, he or she is not nice enough." Or, "I'm afraid this person has ALS, he's too nice." And here's what the neurologist wrote. In spite of the briefness of their contact with the patients and the obvious unscientific method by which they form their opinions, almost invariably these prove to be correct. And I phoned Dr. Wilbur in Cleveland, one of the neurologists, and I asked him how the assembled experts in Munich from around the world responded. He said they all shook their heads and said, "Yeah, we see it too, we just can't explain it." Well, the explanation is simply that those are the people that get sick with ALS. Now, then I looked up the biography of Lou Gehrig. Now, Lou Gehrig, as you know, great athlete. He set a record for a number of hits by a New York Yankee in the 1930s that was only broken by Derek Jeter, I think, 3 years ago. He was also a great athlete in another way. Does anybody know the other record that he set? Most consecutive games played. He never missed a game. Now, it's not that, and that record wasn't broken for nearly 6 decades either. Now, it's not that he never missed a game because he was never sick. He was a human being and an athlete. He got injured and he got ill. It's just that his sense of duty to his fans and to his teammates and to the team's owners, and above all, to his self-image as this iron horse who simply can keep going, chugging along no matter what, prevented him from ever looking after himself by taking time off. At one point his hands were x-rayed, and it turned out that his fingers had been fractured 17 separate times. His teammates described him as grimacing like a maddened monkey in agony as he fielded the ball with those broken hands, and yet he never missed a game. And now notice the double standard. When a teammate of his, a young rookie, got sick with the flu and couldn't play, and the Yankees manager was really upset about this, Gehrig said, "What are you talking about? He can't play, he's sick." And he took this rookie to his own home where he lived with his mom. And his mom put the rookie into Lou Gehrig's own bed. Lou slept on the living room couch while his mother nursed his kid back to health. But Gehrig never missed a game. And he was known as the nicest guy. Now, this is absolutely typical for people with ALS. They're not always nice. The basic thing here is the suppression of emotion, particularly of vulnerable emotion. The bass player, in this case the jazz bass player, Charlie Mingus, died of ALS. He wasn't nice, he used to have these rages, but he was an emotional iceberg otherwise. And the question, of course, arises at this point is, am I blaming patients for their illness? Well, the answer is that I'm not blaming anybody for anything, because these are unconscious patterns that people aren't even not aware of, and even if they know that they're doing it, they don't know why they're doing it, they're just compelled to do it. The basis of it is early childhood experience. The woman who, Lou Gehrig's father was an alcoholic, and how many of you had the experience of either living or witnessing what happens to children in a home where one of the parents is alcoholic? What role is the child put in very often?
Caretaker.
The caregiver, right? And one of the ways to take care of your parents is to suppress your own needs. Because if the parents are incapable of meeting them, or you're trying to protect them from your own needs because they're already stressed enough. Lou Gehrig's father was an alcoholic. Charlie Mingus's mother died when he was 3 months old, and his father used to beat the heck out of him. In the case of the woman that I told you about, the teacher who very shortly afterwards died of her ALS, she was an adopted child. And not long after the adoption, her mother, adoptive mother, got pregnant. as, by the way, happens with interesting frequency, which tells you a little bit about the relationship between infertility and stress. But what do you suppose the story is? Well, the story is that this woman, our patient here, never had the sense that she was celebrated and welcomed like the biological baby was. And she always believed, obviously, that she had to work to justify her existence, work to be loved. And how you do that is you look after other people else's needs, and you're very dutiful, and you're very responsible, and you never ask for help, so you never draw attention. You never bother anybody. So these dynamics then are ingrained very early in life. Have any of you read the book My Tuesdays with Morrie? Okay, so you're familiar with it. Here's a man who dies of ALS, and Morrie is a former teacher whose student, Mitch, Album, writes the book, and when Morrie gets ill with ALS, Mitch visits him every Tuesday, and they have these conversations in which they decide that Morrie has all this wisdom to impart to the world, and Mitch will record that wisdom and write it up or even present it on film, and that'll teach the world some stuff about living and dying that Morrie wants to convey. But what's interesting, of course, is the question of why Morrie wants to do this. Now, does anyone remember what he says, why I want to do this? Why do I want to convey the wisdom of my wisdom as I'm dying to the rest of the world?
He wanted to leave a legacy.
He actually said, I want to prove that dying people aren't useless. Now, what gave him the impression that anybody is useless? That a human being is useless? Or that a human being has to be useful in order to justify his existence? Well, what happened to him as a child? His mother died when he was 12. He was the caregiver to his father and his younger brother. He had no right to a life of his own. And interestingly enough, in that book, towards the end of Morrie's life, Mitch every week brings some food for him, and one week he brings the food, and the wife, Morrie's wife, calls Mitch into the kitchen and says, "Look, don't bring any more food. His swallowing muscles don't work anymore. He can't eat the food that you bring." And she opens the fridge, and there's all the food that Mitch had brought the last couple of weeks. And Mitch is horrified and says, "Well, why didn't you tell me?" And she says, "He didn't want to disappoint you." So even at that stage of life, he's worried about disappointing somebody by not being able to eat the food that this guy's bringing to him. And in palliative care, I looked after a patient once who was the president of a shark cartilage company. And shark cartilage was then marketed as a preventive and a treatment for cancer. And this guy was diagnosed with cancer, metastatic. It had spread all over his body. When he was admitted to our palliative care unit, he had maybe 3 weeks to live, and he kept eating the shark cartilage, which really has a terrible stench to it if you've ever been exposed to it. You can smell it from the end of the hall. And I asked him one day why he's eating it. And I asked him, what does it taste like? He said, "It's awful, I hate it." I said, "Well, why are you eating it?" He says, "Well, I don't believe it's going to make any difference to my life anymore, but my business partner would be so disappointed if I stopped eating." And I convinced him that in the last week of his life, he no longer had to take on other people's disappointment. Now, this dynamic, of course, is very common. In fact, it's inside all of us pretty much in our society. So it's not isolated to people with chronic illness, it's just more rigidly entrenched in them because of childhood experience. And it's actually a coping mechanism. Now let me give you a personal example. So some years before writing this book, when my mother was still alive, she was 78 at the time, and I would have been 54, I visited her in a nursing home where she was an inpatient because she had a congenital form of muscular dystrophy that runs in our family, and she could no longer walk, get out of bed, and she barely lived around to feed herself, and my father was no longer alive. So my mom is in a nursing home, and that day I have a bit of a limp as I walked down the hall of the nursing home. Why do I have a limp? Because that morning I had arthroscopic surgery, which means just a couple of small holes are made here in the side of the knee, and then with tiny instruments and a scope, they go in there and they take out a piece of torn cartilage that I incurred by jogging on cement. And it used to hurt to jog on cement, but as a physician I never realized that pain and tissue damage were possibly connected. So I ended up with a torn meniscus, a torn cartilage in my knee, hence the surgery, hence my limp that afternoon. Because you walk out of hospital after that surgery. Well, when I get to my mother's room, my limp disappears. As I walk to her bed, I greet her, give her a visit. I walk out of the room with a perfectly normal, nonchalant gait, and when I shut the door behind me, my limp resumes. So what do you think I was doing?
Making her feel she won't work.
How was I taking care of her? Suppressing my pain. Now here's the thing, why was I doing it?
So she won't worry.
Yes, exactly. But she's 78. My mother had lived through the Second World War, the Nazi genocide, we're Jewish, the death of her parents in Auschwitz, communist dictatorship, the Hungarian Revolution, emigration to Canada with 2 adolescent boys and her husband, life in a new country at the birth of a new child when she was nearly 40 in a culture that she was a total stranger to, the struggles of any immigrant family to make it in the new world. Do you think she could have handled the fact that her middle-aged son had a bit of a limp the afternoon of arthroscopic knee surgery? This wasn't conscious on my part. It was an ingrained mechanism. Why? Because I spent my first year as a Jewish infant under Nazi occupation in Budapest. And I was 2 months old when the Nazis occupied Hungary. The day after they did, my mother phoned the pediatrician to say, "Would you please come and see Gabor because he's crying all the time?" And my mother said, "Of course I will come, but I should tell you, all my Jewish babies are crying." Now, what were those babies responding to? What do any stressed population of children respond to? What do Palestinian children being shelled by the Israelis in Gaza respond to? What do Iraqi children being shelled by the American military respond to? Their own parents' stresses. And that gets deeply ingrained. And in that terrible first year of my life, and I don't have to tell you the conditions, when my mother was so depressed, she barely got out of bed to look after me, I learned very early not to bother her with my pain. Because as children, as infants, we have 2 fundamental needs. We have 2 fundamental needs. The first and primary need is for attachment. Now, attachment in this case is not attachment in the Buddhist sense of clinging to externals. Attachment simply means the connection and being close to and requiring proximity to another person for the purpose of being taken care of, or conversely, for the purpose of taking care of. That's what attachment means psychologically, as I'm sure you understand. And the child's attachment needs are paramount for the very simple reason that the human child is the least mobile and the most dependent and the most helpless of any creature in the universe, and stays that way for the longest period of time. So as infants, we don't survive without attachment. So the attachment needs are absolutely primary. And we'll do whatever it takes to maintain our attachments. Because without that, literally, we don't live. Well, we have another need as well. A deep human need that we all experience. And we certainly experience the suffering that arises when it's not available to us, which is authenticity. Being ourselves, which really means being in touch with ourselves, being aware of and being able to honor our gut feelings and express ourselves for who we are, not to meet the expectation of somebody else. But that's a survival need as well. Because imagine human beings in the state of nature, in the hazy evolutionary past, unless we're deeply in touch with ourselves, we don't survive. You better know what your gut feelings are, and you'll be able to respond right away. So that's also a survival need. But, and that's good, if the situation permits both needs to be fulfilled, then of course there's no problem. But what happens when the attachment needs are threatened by the child's authenticity? So if your parents come from a home where there's a lot of yelling and violence, and they can't handle anger, and so they really react against you. When there's a 2-year-old going into a tantrum, as a 2-year-old, you're going to go into a tantrum, because that's your response to frustration. If they react to you in a way that's really threatening, you will learn to suppress your anger in order to maintain the attachment. And you will not learn it consciously. It's not a decision you'll ever make. It's simply a brain defense. It's just a coping dynamic. And because it's unconscious, it gets ingrained in your personality. And your personality really is very often not who you are at all, but your coping mechanisms grafted onto who you are. So that style of pleasing others, of not disappointing anybody, of taking on duty, role, and responsibility, of not being able to say no, of not being able to experience genuine healthy aggression and express it when it needs to be expressed. These are not choices anybody makes. These are not faults. They're not mistakes. They're not failures. They're coping mechanisms that we become so identified with that we think that's who we are. And that means we're going to follow those patterns all our life. In fact, we'll be very afraid. We'll be very afraid if the situation demands that we act otherwise. So sometimes I do these workshops, and I ask people to say no. They actually can't say the word without crying, especially when there's some emotion involved. Now, so that's the story. We're looking at childhood mechanisms. Therefore, we're not blaming anybody, but we are saying that the illness isn't accidental, and the illness, whatever form it takes, is actually a way of the body saying no when you didn't say it yourself. And I don't know if there's anybody here who's experienced chronic illness, but I'm sure many of you have talked to people who've had chronic illness or even terminal illness, and more than just infrequently, you'll hear somebody say that this illness, even this terminal illness, is the best thing that ever happened to me. Has anybody ever heard any people say stuff like that? Yeah, quite a few of you have. What do they mean by that? What they mean by it is that the illness awoke them who they really were, to who they really were. It put them in touch with their authentic selves. It was a way to learn for them about themselves. Now, I'm not celebrating illness, and I'm certainly not recommending it as a way to learn. But it can be experienced, it has been experienced by many people that way. The point, though, is that therapeutically and if we talk about healing here, which is the work that many of you are committed to, when you talk, either in your own life, learn how to say no before your body has to say it for you, number one. And number two, when illness or symptom shows up, don't just seek to get rid of it as if it was the problem. I mean, yeah, try to get rid of it, try and get help with it. I'm not saying not to, but at the same time, ask the question, what is my body saying no to here that I haven't said no to myself? And what can I learn from this? And I know from many, many examples that when people engage in that conversation with themselves, that can actually positively affect the course of their illness. Flare-ups of multiple sclerosis or rheumatoid arthritis or almost any illness. I'm not saying everybody could be saved. I'm not saying this is the panacea. I'm saying, however, that it's a powerful healing route that whatever else we do, our work is to help people get authentic, to become more themselves. Now, how does all this work physiologically? Well, contrary to the way that medical education still imparts information, the mind and body can't be separated. Now, that's not a new thought or awareness in human life. Ayurvedic medicine of India has always assumed that. The traditional Chinese medicine has always assumed that. Shamanic tribal medicines around the world have always assumed that mind-body can't be separated. Western medicine, with all its truly wonderful and sometimes miraculous techniques, pharmacology, investigative capacities, has always been based on the unstated principle that mind and body are separate. The bitter irony is, these days, is that the science has not caught up with the ancient wisdom. In other words, the science has now shown that mind and body can't be separated, and that to do so is to be unscientific. Not that you're ignoring ancient wisdom, it's that you're ignoring modern science. There's a new discipline, a fairly new discipline, called psychoneuroimmunology, that studies the interconnections, or to give it its technically proper name, psychoneuroimmunoendocrinology, which simply means the study of how the psyche, or the emotional centers in the brain, are connected with the immune system, with the hormonal apparatus, and the nervous system. And it turns out that these four systems, nervous, hormonal, emotional, and what else is it? Immune system, they're not even separate systems. They're one system with different manifestations. But they're all joined together so that you can't even talk about them being connected to each other. You can only talk about them as being one system. To talk about them as separate, as one researcher said, is artifactual. It's an artifact of the past. How are they connected? They're connected in a number of ways. Now the psyche, in this case I'm talking about physiologically, not just about the abstract psyche, but the emotional centers in the brain. Our limbic system is connected with the nervous system, the immune apparatus, and the hormonal system by means of the nervous system itself. So the nervous system wires them all together into one giant electrical grid. So nerves go from the brain's emotional centers to the hypothalamus, which is at the apex of it's in the brain, and it's at the apex of the body's autonomic nervous system that controls muscle tone, heart rate, contractions of the intestines, many other body functions. And it's connected to the fibers from the brain go to the spleen where the red cells are stored, to the bone marrow where the red cells are manufactured, and the white cells, to the thymus gland in the neck where the T cells, the immune cells mature, and fibers from all these organs go back up to the brain. So these organs are all interconnected through the nervous system, the giant electrical grid. So whatever is registered in one aspect of the system is registered in the other parts of the system. That's the first form of connection. The second form of connection is by means of chemical messengers that each of these systems secrete into the circulation, for which all the others have receptors. So those receptors, as you know, are molecules on the surface of our cells where messenger molecules can bind, and the binding of messenger and receptor then creates a reaction in the membrane of the cell, which then tells the DNA, the genetic material in the cell, what to do. So far from gene being predominant, the genes are actually turned on and off by the environment, and that study is called epigenetics. So there's that connection. So there's this constant biochemical crosstalk. So it turns out that the white cells, or the immune cells in your circulation, can manufacture every hormone that your brain can manufacture. And so the immune system is talking to the brain and vice versa. And of course that's what makes sense, because it's all one system, all designed to help you survive and to adapt to your environment. A third form of connection is through the gut. Now it turns out that the gut is much more than a digestive organ. Usually when we think of the gut, we think of it only as a digestive organ. But actually it has many other functions. It's a major immune organ. It has many immune centers to protect your body from the intrusion of toxic materials. And it's also a major sensory organ with many nerve centers. If you've taken Prozac for depression, which elevates serotonin levels in the brain as a way of counteracting some of the chemical effects of depression, the gut has more serotonin than the brain does. It's a major nervous system organ. It has many nerve centers, and it sends many more messages to the brain than the brain sends to it. But it's been called the second brain. Now, so there's a constant two-way communication with the brain and the gut. Now let me ask you this question, and I'm going to ask for a show of hands, please. Those of you that have the following experience, please put your hand up. The experience is that you have a powerful gut feeling about something, you didn't pay attention to it, you ignored it, and you regretted it afterwards. Have you had that experience? Okay. Now, how many have had the opposite experience of having a powerful gut feeling about something, ignoring it, and being grateful afterwards? So we see much fewer hands now. I mean, much fewer. I would probably argue with you that you didn't really have a gut feeling at all, but yet it was a strong emotion, and there's a difference. And emotions can be wrong. Gut feelings will never be wrong. But I want you to consider what you just told me about your lives. Now, let me ask you this question. Have you ever met any infant a 2-day-old that suppressed their gut feelings. If you think you have, try feeding them something they don't want to eat. You'll be worrying. So infants are infinitely in touch with their gut feelings. In fact, that's all they got to go on. Which means your true nature is to be in touch with your gut feelings. What happened? What happened for pretty much all of us here is that at some point, in order to maintain our attachment relationships, we had to suppress our gut feelings. Because the true expression and manifestation of our gut feelings would have brought us into conflict with our caring environment, and our needs for attachment would have been threatened. Or at least that's what we perceived. This is not because we had bad parents, but we may have had very stressed parents who couldn't tune to our gut feelings and somehow were threatened by them or bothered by them, or we could have had abusive parents, which is, of course, even leads to even more suppression of gut feeling. But all of you put your hand up in that response to that first question. That's the story you've told me. So you need to look at your own lives, and maybe you already are looking at them from that angle. Now, there's a fourth connection that when I wrote this book I didn't even know about yet, which is the heart-brain connection. It turns out that the heart itself is a nervous system. Like it's got a brain, like a set of nerves that's surrounded in the pericardium, which is the fibrous membrane that surrounds the heart, and that heart-brain has predictive capacities, particularly for negative things. So when you say you knew in my heart, you did. And that brain here, or that nervous system here, communicates with the brain up here. And I could name you a couple forms of connection. I'm not going to, and I'm sure in 100 years we'll know another 100. But the point has already been established beyond the point of controversy, that mind and body can't be separated, that whatever happens emotionally will also be manifested physiologically for these reasons. So let me come then to the example of what I call healthy aggression or healthy anger, and in order to illustrate how this might lead to, and by the way, it's been shown that in people that suppress their anger, they have diminished activity of their natural killer cells, which are a group of immune cells that fight cancer. So there's a very practical reason why people who suppress anger are predictably at increased risk for cancer. Now, in order to demonstrate this, I need a volunteer from the room, somewhere where I can really get a little bit closer to you. You don't have to do anything, just stay where you are, but you might feel, okay, thanks. I mean, you might feel a bit uncomfortable, but nothing bad's going to happen, okay? There's only one rule for this exercise, which is that you can't leave your seat where you are located represents your life. You can't leave it. Okay, you got it? You can't leave it, you can't move away from it. Otherwise, you're welcome to respond any way that you're moved to respond, okay? Your name is?
Cat.
Kathy?
Cat.
Kat. Okay, great. So Kat, what I'm going to ask you is, are you comfortable with the distance between you and I right now? If I gave the rest of the lecture from this position, is that okay with you?
Yes. I think
Okay.
it's kind of uncomfortable either way, so it doesn't matter.
It's uncomfortable?
Yeah, in general, it's an awkward situation, so I think either way is fine. Up there is fine.
Okay, perfect. Well, then I'm going to come a bit closer. And I'm going to ask you, is this still okay with you? If I gave the rest of the lecture standing here?
Yeah, I've got a great view.
Well, I think you do, but... yeah. Okay, how about right now? Is that still comfortable for you?
No.
It's not. Now, what would you do about it?
In this exact circumstance, I would ask you to step back, but
Fair
in
enough.
daily life, that would be hard for me to say.
Okay, so you asked me to step back. Fair enough. And you asked me nicely, and I said no, and I come even closer. Then what?
I would want to remove myself from the circumstance.
But again, this is a metaphor for your life. You can't
Yeah.
leave it. So what are you
Right.
going to do? So that's not an option.
Yeah. I would need to get more aggressive and,
Right. Push me.
yeah,
Okay. And as you did, as you got more aggressive, what emotion would be coming up for you?
anger.
Right. In short, healthy anger is not an unhealthy emotion. Healthy anger is simply a boundary defense. It simply says, you're in my space, get out. And if you generate that early enough, you never have to come to a fight. Because I get it. And in the animal world, when one creature enters the lair or the territory of another, that's exactly what you get, is a rage display that prevents them from having to come to a physical fight. It actually protects them. So healthy anger is simply a boundary defense. In fact, the immune system itself is a boundary. The immune system has been called a floating brain. It has three capacities that the brain has. It has memory, it has learning capacity, and it has reactive capacity, which is exactly what the brain does. Learns, memorizes, and responds. And as I said, it's in touch with the brain's emotional centers. In fact, the role of emotions, what is the role of emotions? Basically, when you get down to it, the role of emotions is very simple. I mean, there's all kinds of elaborations and complexities, but fundamentally, emotions come down to self-protection. So that it's either, I want more of this because this is nurturing and protective, or I want less of it or none of it at all because it's dangerous and intrusive and unwelcome. So the role of emotions is to invite in what's healthy and what's nourishing and supportive, but to keep out which is unwelcome and potentially risky and dangerous. That's the role of the emotions. What is the role of the immune system? Well, can you see it's exactly the same thing? It's to recognize what is healthy, nutrients and so on, and let it in, and what is unhealthy, bacteria, and keep it out. So they have exactly the same function. And given when they're connected, when you're acting on one of those systems, you're also working on the other. So when you're suppressing emotions, you're actually disabling your immune system. And in some cases, you're just like the anger that you don't express, what happens to it? Does it evaporate? Does it go away? What does it turn against? It turns against the self. In the same way, the immune system turns against the self in the form of what they call autoimmune disease. Autoimmune simply means that the immune system attacks the body. And multiple sclerosis, and rheumatoid arthritis, and scleroderma, and systemic lupus, colitis, Crohn's disease, these are all forms of autoimmune disease. And when you study the personalities of the people that get these illnesses, what you recognize, and their childhoods, what you recognize is exactly the same patterns that I've been talking about. It's not surprising, therefore, that the more adversity a person has had in early childhood, the greater the risk of not just addiction, which is another topic that I talk and write about, but also physical illness. And a Canadian study, for example, showed that if a child has experienced abuse, his risk or her risk of cancer as an adult goes up by a factor of 50%. For all kinds of physiological reasons, as you understand. Now, the common factor in all this is stress. And stress is not just an emotional experience. Stress is a physiological experience. What happens in stress is that the body or the emotional centers basically perceive a threat. So they generate the stress response by which you produce more adrenaline and more cortisol, which hormones produced by the adrenal gland here in the top of the kidneys will give you more sugar, so they have more energy and strength and increased blood flow so that you can fight or to escape the threat. That's the acute stress response. It's necessary for life, but chronic stress is a different story. Chronic stress undermines health. And when you're engaged in these patterns, automatically and compulsively, you're chronically stressed. What's it like to be suppressing anger all the time? What's it like to be always ignoring your own needs? What's it like to be always worried about what other people think of you? Highly stressful. And that means that these stress hormones are circulating in your system. And cortisol, we well know, can thin the bones, cause osteoporosis, alterations of the intestines, depression, redistribution of body fat in a way that is more conducive to heart disease, and suppresses the immune system. So whether that cortisol is given to you in the form of medication, and by the way, interestingly enough, what is the one medication we use right across the board? Cortisol, the stress hormone. Whether you've got a chronic skin condition like eczema or psoriasis, whether you've got a chronic lung condition like asthma, whether you have colitis or Crohn's disease, multiple sclerosis, joint diseases like rheumatoid arthritis, at some point you're going to get cortisol. In other words, we're giving the stress hormone to people, and we're not even asking ourselves, is stress maybe connected to the onset of this illness? It would seem like an obvious question. So it's that chronic stress, and stress has three components, really. There's the physiological stress response, which I just described to you. Then there's the external trigger. But you notice something. There's no universal external trigger. There's no universal stressor. That's called the stressor, the external event that causes the stress. There's no universal stressor. I mean, if you are a Republican, then you would have been stressed out by watching Bill Clinton's speech last night. On the other hand, if you're a liberal in this country, you might have been quite stressed out by watching all the derision that accompanied Mitt Romney's comments about global warming. So there's no universal stressor, because in between the external stressor and the physiological stress response, it's what's been called the processing apparatus. And the processing apparatus is that which, well, the processing apparatus is you, with your particular meanings and interpretations. So the same event will happen, but two different people interpret it in different ways. So for me, in my marriage, in my 43-year marriage, any sense of, well, my wife saying no to me would bring up a very childish response. I can tell you the story. So we've married 43 years now. So let's say in the past, 15 years ago, Ray, my wife, says no one night when I try to make a physical advance. And she says, no, not tonight. And so I know it's, for many of you gathered here in a sunny afternoon, it's difficult to believe, but it actually has happened sometimes. And how do I respond? Well, in my case, and here I am, like 68 now, so let's see, 15 years ago, age 53, I'm the director of palliative care and a national medical columnist and a successful family doctor. And how do I respond? I respond by either going to a rage, or more likely curling up into a fetal ball and wishing that I was dead. And next morning I can't even look her in the eye. I can't look her in the eye. Now, that's not the response of an adult. I mean, I read the Buddha, attachment to outcomes. I've listened to Mick Jagger, you can't always get what you want. What's this all about? In writing my first book on attention deficit disorder, with which I was diagnosed when I was 52, I came across the work of John Bowlby, the great British psychiatrist and researcher of attachment. And Bowlby describes a situation in England where, in the 30s, I think this was, or 40s, parents were discouraged from visiting their children when they were hospitalized. The child is hospitalized, the parents are told, don't come to see your child because it's too upsetting for him to come and see you come and go, to watch you come and go all the time. So these kids don't see their mothers for a few weeks. And how does the child respond when the mother doesn't show up for a few weeks? Well, how do you imagine a child respond? The first response would be anxiety, because my attachment is being threatened. Like the amygdala, the fear center in the brain is going off like an alarm bell, because my attachment is missing on which my life depends. A few days later, the child gives up, becomes depressed, non-responsive, won't eat very much, won't play, won't interact. And then nature says, okay kid, mother, no mother, you're going to have to survive, you're going to have to start eating again, you're going to have to interact, and so on. And the child does, they look quite normal, until the mother comes back. And what happens when the mother comes back? The child won't even look at the mother. And that's called a detachment. What is the purpose of it? It's a coping mechanism. The purpose of it is, the brain says, the child doesn't say this consciously, but the brain says, you were so hurt when you were abandoned that you never open yourself up again to that kind of rejection. Therefore, just don't be attached. Look away, and then you won't be hurt. When I was 11 months old, my mother gave me to a total stranger in the street and said, please take this baby away. And that was to save my life under conditions that you can imagine. So I didn't see her for 3 weeks. And she didn't know whether she'd be alive or dead the next day. When I read that study by Bowlby, I asked my mom, how did I respond after our 3-week separation? She said, like an utter stranger, you wouldn't even look at me for several days. Now guess what happens 52 years later? The memory of that gets triggered, and I respond like an infant. Now, it's not a conscious memory, because if it was a conscious memory, then I could just say, hey, when you say no to me, I feel just like I did when I was 11 months old, when I didn't see my mother. And I'd be fine. It's an unconscious memory, and that's the kind of memory that's called implicit memory. An implicit memory is the imprinting of early experience in the brain, the emotional resonance of early experience, without recollection for the actual episodes or details. The structure in the brain that encodes conscious memory, recall memory, which is called explicit memory, doesn't develop till you're about a year and a half old. But implicit memory is there from before birth, probably in the last 3 months of pregnancy. And many of the reactions that your clients exhibit in life, or that you exhibit in life, have nothing to do with what's happening in the present, but actually are based on the past, and they represent implicit memories. So you can very often tell what a person's early childhood was like simply by talking to them for half an hour. And how do they respond to things, and what kind of stories do they tell, and what kind of problems do they come to you with. They're telling you their life story, but they don't know that, because it's unconscious. And the task of therapy, surely, is to make the unconscious conscious. So people actually begin to have some choice in the matter. Because if I can recognize that, yeah, I got this deep feeling of disappointment and pain and so on, but really it's got nothing to do with the present, just some old stuff is being triggered, then I'm no longer at the effect of it, quite to the same degree, and gradually not at all. So that's the point. Now, before I finish this talk and take some conversation, I'm going to play a bit of music. And in the second chapter of my book, I describe the story of British cellist Jacqueline du Pré. Jacqueline du Pré was a child virtuoso who was a prodigy from early age on, and was a real star on the international classical music circuit. What was remarkable about her performance is the emotionality of her playing. She really infused her playing with tremendous feeling. So, and she wasn't sedate. She wasn't still on the stage. Her body would move, and her long blonde hair would fly in the air, and she would put all her heart and soul into her music, so much so that people wept at her performances. But in her personal life, she never knew how to express emotions. In fact, she did not want to be a cellist. She said it would kill me, but she said so many people would be disappointed if I stopped. And she continued until she developed multiple sclerosis in her mid-20s, and within a short period of time she could no longer play, and she died in her early 40s of multiple sclerosis. They talk about her cello voice, because only through her cello could she express emotion, but never in her personal life. So typically, even when she began to develop symptoms of of multiple sclerosis, she was hiding it. And she always felt that there was a wall between her and the world that only dropped when she was on stage. The piece I'm going to play for you is the Elgar Cello Concerto, which Sir Edward Elgar wrote in 1917 in the midst of the carnage of the First World War. At the time he was totally depressed, and he wrote, "Everything nice and sweet and clean and fresh is far away, never to return." Her sister, Jackie's sister, Gilda, also a musician, wrote, "Jackie's ability to portray the emotions of a man in the autumn of his life was one of her extraordinary and inexplicable capacities." My comment is, extraordinary, yes; inexplicable, perhaps not. Although she was unaware of it, by the time she was 20, Jacqueline du Pré was also in the autumn of her life. The illness that was soon to end her musical career was only a few years away. Regret, loss, and resignation had all been too abundantly a part of her own unspoken emotional experience. She understood Elgar because she had partaken of the same suffering. His portrait always disturbed her. He had a miserable life hill, she told her sibling, and he was ill, yet throughout it all he had a radiant soul, and that's what I feel in his music. Now, what do you suppose she's talking about? Herself. Her story was that she was still in the maternity hospital with her mother within a couple of days of her birth when her grandfather, the mother's father, died. Two and the mother had been very close. Guess what role Jackie, the infant, was thrust into? The mother's emotional supporter. She was not allowed to have her own emotions. Now, the mother did not do this consciously, but that was the dynamic. So in order to all her life she protected her mother. When she was 7 or 8, she said to Hillary, Hill, don't tell our mommy this, but when I grow up, I won't be able to move or walk. Something in her was telling her something. But notice, don't tell our mommy this. If you had a 7, 8-year-old child with such fears, who would you want to talk to? You, but not her. When she went to Russia as a prodigy to study the cello, she was raped there. When she comes back to England, she says to her sister, Hill, don't tell her mommy this, but I was raped in Russia. Don't tell her mommy this. Jackie, as always, was speaking through her cello. I could hear what she was saying. I could almost see tears on her face. She was saying goodbye to herself, playing her own requiem. Now, that's not the recording I'll play for you. The recording I'll play for you was made when Jacqueline the babe was 20. There are many beautiful performances of this concerto, none quite as emotive to my ears as this particular one, of which we'll now play a few minutes. I think it's track 4. No, try track 5. Hit louder, please. More volume. Thank you. me to finish, or just read you a little bit about Gilda Radner. Again, I didn't know anything about her, except I knew that she died of ovarian cancer, the comedian on Saturday Night Live. So I looked at her biography. It turned out that she had been a very unhappy child. She was very overweight as a child. She was thin as an adult because she was a bulimic. So all the time she was starved, she was actually a closet bulimic. Never told her mother. Her mother didn't find out till after her death that her daughter had been a bulimic, protecting her mother. Her father died when she was young. She was 12, I think. She never overcame that loss, and all her life she tried to fit herself into a relationship with men, in a way to please the men, not according to her own needs. She never felt close to her mother. The only way she could feel close to her mother was to make her laugh. She was a self-confessed workaholic who she would write, "Let stress and pressure run my precious life." Even after her symptoms of ovarian cancer began to cause physical distress, including bowel blockage, Radner was more concerned with satisfying others than with her own needs. She sought and received advice from sundry sources. Her dilemma: suddenly I began to wonder how to please so many people. Now, whose advice do I take? Do I take the magnesium citrate? What about the coffee enema? Do I do both? Do I do the abdominal massage or the colonic? Do I tell the doctors about each other? Eats meets West in Gilda's body. Western medicine down my throat, Eastern medicine up my butt. When it seemed she had been successfully treated, Gilda became a poster girl for ovarian cancer, featured on the cover of Life magazine. She was an inspiration to many, but the recovery was short-lived. Still attached to her roles she developed as a child, she berated herself for, quote, having let down others by developing terminal illness. I had become a spokeswoman for the wellness community and a symbol of getting well. I had been a model cancer patient, completely active in my own therapy. Now I felt like a living example that didn't work. I'm just a fraud, I thought. Only close to her death did Gilda finally learn that she could not be mother to the world. I couldn't do everything I wanted to do. I couldn't keep calling all the cancer patients I knew, and I couldn't try to help heal all the women with ovarian cancer, and I couldn't read every letter I received because it was ripping me apart. I couldn't cry all those tears for everybody else. I had to take care of myself. It is important to realize that you have to take care of yourself because you can't take care of anybody else until you do. Even then she didn't quite get it. She was still justifying taking care of herself because then she'd be able to take care of others. She almost got it, but not quite. The great Canadian stress researcher from Hungary like myself, Hans or Janos Selye, who actually coined the word stress in the way we use it today, and he did all the stress research in the laboratory that proves the effects of stress. Nearly won a Nobel Prize for medicine. He said that in civilized society, for sure, in modern life, the stresses that we face, mostly are emotional ones, and the biggest stress of all, he says, is trying to be who we're not. So whether for ourselves or for clients, the message really is that to maintain health or to regain it, we have to know who we are and we have to be who we are. So, if this is a prolonged workshop setting, there's much more I would tell you, many more exercises that I would lead you through to illustrate this stuff and how to work with it. But right now we have about 20 minutes left, 15 minutes for questions. So let's just begin with that. Have I stunned you all or what? Yeah.
I'm curious because a woman that we just got us listened to, she was really expressing herself so much through music.
Unconsciously.
And so is that the key?
Conscious, yeah. You have to be conscious. If it's not conscious, it doesn't work.
Okay. So
Okay.
it's critical example.
Yeah. In her personal life, she just did the opposite. Until, at the very end of her life, when her mind couldn't control herself anymore, and she exploded this rage, vicious rage towards her parents, who didn't know what hit them. They had no idea where this came from, but it was all that suppressed rage that she'd been controlling all her life. Yes?
You talk a lot about, I think, diseases that are normally theorized as being genetic.
Yeah.
But then with your aspect, could you talk about that quickly?
Yeah, well, I mean, I could give you a whole talk on genetics and how completely the data is misused. But fundamentally, there are very few diseases that are genetically predetermined. One of them is Huntington's chorea, which is a neurological degenerative disorder. If you get the Huntington's gene, you have a 99% risk of developing the disease. Not 100%, interestingly enough, but 99%. But that's very rare. Those diseases maybe account for 1 person in 10,000 in the population. Most diseases have either no or very little genetic basis. Now take something like breast cancer. They talk about the breast cancer gene. You know, out of 100 women with breast cancer, how many actually have the gene? 7. 93 do not. No out of 100 women with the gene do 100 get sick with the cancer. In other words, even when there's a predisposition genetically, that's not the same as a predetermination. And when you actually look at the lives of people with breast cancer, well, these are all the stories that I've just told you about. And even, so that even when there's a genetic contribution, it's not a determinant. It just increases the risk somewhat. And so that needs to be paid attention to. But it's not the whole picture. In fact, it's a small part of the picture. You can have the gene and not have the disease, and you can have the disease without the gene. Okay? And I'm not going to go into the mechanics of why the genetic studies are next to useless in many, many cases, but they really are. Because what they fundamentally miss the point is genes are turned on and off by the environment. That's epigenetics. And if you don't believe me, take a seed of wheat and plant it in this floor, see how well it will grow. It doesn't have the environment to turn the genes on to make that gene, that seed grow. That's simplistic, but it's kind of a metaphoric illustration. Yes?
In your book, you talk about becoming addicted to your own stress hormones.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that at all?
Yeah, I mean, the question is being addicted to your own stress hormone. If you've been stressed from, like I'm somebody who's addicted to my own stress hormones. Because I've been stressed since before I was conceived. I can't say before I was conceived, but in another life, but since I was conceived. So I'm used to the internal milieu. So when there's nothing to do and there's no external engagement, I get kind of uncomfortable. And that means that I'm addicted to something, and addiction means that you're engaging in behavior or creating a state that ultimately is harmful for you. So people can get addicted to their own adrenaline, the so-called adrenaline junkies. And these are the people that then, in another way, will follow extreme sports or dangerous activities, because they need that adrenaline rush. That's what it means to be addicted to your own stress hormones. Okay? Yes?
Going back to the question about genetics,
Yeah.
do you include cystic fibrosis in that category?
Cystic fibrosis is very much genetically determined.
Okay.
And, so are some forms of muscular dystrophy. So there are diseases, but again, those are really rather rare. And most of the conditions that we're talking about are not determined genetically. Yes?
You talked a lot about kind of early life or experiences in early life, in early childhood, and they're extremely, I think, insightful and very important, like you demonstrated. But do you also agree that maybe modern society or Western society, and more particularly like post-industrial, like we have devalued gut feeling and intuition, and so we have valued more the intellect and critical thinking of the mind, and therefore we, as people in general, as humans, we have learned to kind of shut down our intuition and not listen to it. And
Well,
that also can contribute.
Sure, this is not an individual question.
Yeah.
It is not just a question of an individual's family history. It's also a question of the culture that we live in. And my next book, in fact, if I get to write it, the perspective title is Toxic Culture, How Materialistic Society Makes Us Sick. And it'll be a broader social level examination of some of what I've been talking about today. And of course, there is this separation of mind and body in Western culture in general, particularly in capitalist culture. And that's for a good reason. Because if you're going to sell people things they don't need, and if you're going to exploit them, they better not be in touch with their gut feelings. It's not a plot, it's just how the system works. So that this system engenders a lot of separation for a lot of reasons between ourselves and ourselves. So it's very much a systemic problem, for sure. You had a question?
Is there any research done on remission for like MS or ALS?
Remission? Yes. We have these miraculous remissions, and it was in the case of malignant melanoma, and I think it was here in San Francisco actually, that the research was done where some groups at the same stage of the disease, some of them had some psychotherapy and some had nothing at all, and it was shown that the therapy group did much better. And I know there are actually individual examples of people who actually survive and even remit completely from ALS, rarely, but they do. I describe one of them in the book from the literature. I've had numerous people with MS particularly write to me to tell me that this book has saved their lives. Not that the book has saved their lives, but the lessons that they've learned themselves, which they applied in their lives. Some that's better than the author has, actually. Has made a difference to the non-activation of the multiple sclerosis. And I know at least one woman with stage 4 breast cancer, already in her bones when it was diagnosed 12 years ago, who was given 1 year to live with the best medical treatment, who is still alive because she got in touch with the fact that as an abused child she learned to suppress herself and she stopped doing it. And now the cancer is still in her bones, but it's completely inactive. There's lots of these remissions, and the qualities of the people that do experience remission are always a kind of an awakening to their real selves. Yes?
Okay, could you say something about maybe how you did it, or how to navigate that conflict between being ourselves and being in relationship with others, or maybe sometimes in harmony, because there seems to be like those competing expectations.
Well, at some point we all have a decision to make. Would we rather be liked or so-called loved at any cost, or would we rather be ourselves? Now, but the dilemma is that if you're not yourself and people love you for who you're not, you still don't feel loved. It's never satisfying because you think, what would they really feel about me if they really knew what was going on for me? So you can't win that way. But of course, that's how you learn to survive, so it's hard to give it up. But at some point, we have to ask ourselves that question, and then and that may be threatening to some of your relationships. When people start asserting who they are and saying no to things that they experience an inward no towards, or they start saying yes to things that they didn't say yes to before, even though they wanted to. Some people in our lives won't be able to handle that. And then you're going to find out who really loves you and who your friends really are. But there's always, you're going to have to give something up. You're going to have to give up inauthentic relationships, or you're going to have to give up your authentic self. And it's a difficult process because it goes against all our programming. Yes?
I can't help but hear a lot of this as like advocating for therapy, basically, in a room full of potential therapists. I'm wondering, when you speak in other venues, do you meet any resistance or people that really challenge your ideas?
The people that invite me generally want to hear this message. The people that don't want to hear my message don't invite me. When I talk to medical audiences, it's rather interesting. Whether I talk about this or whether I talk about, like tonight I'm talking at this California Association of Addiction Medicine, and I'll be giving my view of addiction as trauma-based, that I express in my book, In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts. It'll be very interesting to see what kind of response I get. When I speak to medical audiences, which doesn't happen all that much, but when I do, I present a more clinical talk with more kind of research evidence, because that's, and what I often get is not resistance, but a kind of silence. That you don't know what to make of it. And I could speculate, and I have speculated, what's that about? I mean, it's not that they challenge, it's that they just don't know how to approach the question. Because intellectually, they can't argue with the evidence. It's there. But emotionally, it doesn't fit for them. They're kind of shut down to their own vulnerability, really. So I don't get a lot of resistance that way, because generally I don't get invited to too many places where that resistance would exist. It's interesting when it happens, but I've never had a whole lot of argumentation. I just get more kind of a stunned, okay, now what? Yeah.
So good to see you back here again. It's
Thank
great.
you.
Our students in integrative health sometimes fall into a trap of new age thinking, I call it, where if someone feels they can't muster the inner psychic strength to reverse a chronic disorder through lots of newfound discoveries that my mind can actually stop this in its tracks and reverse it, that not only are they sick, but they have more guilt.
It adds to the
mustering
burden, yeah.
strength. How can we help them address that?
Well, first of all, you know, I never say to somebody, if you just thought differently, you'd be better. You know, I mean, I don't talk that way. Because I know personally it's not true. It's one thing for me to give this lecture, it's another thing for me to live it. You know, so I don't buy into that kind of message. If I was working with somebody like that, I would ask them, if that person feels guilty, for example, I would ask them, when in your life did you not feel guilty? Their guilt predates the illness. Their guilt predates any relationship. It predates anything they ever did. That guilt was a response to stuff that happened in childhood. So I would just actually look at the guilt itself, is what I would do. I would examine the guilt with very patient, compassionate inquiry. That's how I would handle it. Okay, yes?
I'm currently working with women in recovery.
Yeah.
And so I suppose this applies to anyone. I really think of, or in speaking about the authentic self, it seems there are so many. There's the inner child maybe that you mentioned earlier. There can be, I meet with a protective, fierce mother a lot. I'm faced with the addict mind on a daily basis. And often they're learning how to feel. They can't discern gut from feeling.
Mm-hmm.
I have a hard time with that with myself.
Yeah, we all do.
And so I'm wondering, how have you helped your clients with finding that authentic self or finding the self to go with?
Well, we don't mythologize the authentic self. Like there's this authentic self to be found. They just keep looking for it. Oh yeah, there she is. You know?
They think that though.
I know. So you get away from that. You say simply, what is there for you right now? And what is there for them right now might be an emotion they can identify, or it might be just a vague feeling here in the solar plexus area of discomfort, or a tightening, or a pins and needles, you know, tension, whatever's going on. That's what's authentic at that moment. So that's how you work with it. You don't look for this mythological entity called authentic self, and you know, okay. This is very much based on the present moment, and of course, all the spiritual teachers from Buddha onward, and most saliently the Buddha, emphasize the present moment to be experienced. Yeah. Okay.
I really appreciate your points about a healthy relationship to aggression, especially as a female that's been enculturated to do otherwise.
Yes.
And also, as part of this institute, actually, I feel like there's a real...
Can you just speak up a little bit for me?
Okay, trying. Yeah. There's a real unintegrated shadow, I feel like, in a lot of spiritual communities that I've explored around a healthy relationship to anger as well. But I'm also thinking about the cardiac research on the toxic effects of excessive hostility. So I'm wondering how you reconcile those two.
Oh yeah, sure. Well, there's a distinction between unhealthy anger and healthy anger. In the aftermath of a rage episode, your risk of a heart attack or stroke doubles for the next 2 hours. Because at that moment you generate a lot of adrenaline, your blood pressure goes up, your blood vessels narrow, and clotting factors increase in the blood. That's on the difference in rage and healthy anger. Healthy anger that Kat demonstrated is simply in the moment. It's functional. It says, you're in my space, get out. That's the end of it. It doesn't simmer and persist and magnify. It simply does its job and then it's gone. The unhealthy anger that you talk about is the chronic rage that simmers and blows, and the more you express it, the greater it gets, the more brain circuits it recruits, and the more adrenaline that it generates, and so on. So that's the distinction, is that healthy anger is functional, it's in the moment, does its job, disappears. And that kind of anger is past-based, whereas healthy anger is present-based. I can take one more question, I think. Yes?
I've read some of your books, and it's very clear that you've worked with individuals from communities of color and oppressed cultures.
Yeah.
And as you talk about this authentic self, as you talk about the denial of who the self is, can you speak briefly about advice you would give or how it plays out when you are in one cultural location and dominant culture is requiring a different face, a different set of behaviors, whether it's around working class culture versus middle class culture, African American, et cetera. So any comments on that?
Well, it's very, very, I don't think it's accidental that, I think the statistic is right, that black males in this country have double the risk of dying of prostate cancer than Caucasians, whereas their biological relatives in Africa don't. So it's not a genetic issue, because they're the same genes. It's a cultural issue. It's the frustration and enforced self-suppression. And this morning I was visiting some facilities in San Francisco that looked after homeless people and so on, and one of the nurses was telling me about this guy that he's working with who, after a relationship had been established and he's actually getting better, but he says to her, how do I deal with the rage of being a black male in this culture? So I understand that question very much. I think, but there's nothing unique to the black or to any other minority experience. It's heightened for the reasons that you mentioned, historical and ongoing in the present reasons. I mean, the election of a so-called black president, and I say so-called because why is he more black than he's white? If you actually look at it genetically. But that's a whole other conversation. The real situation of blacks in this country has not got better significantly. Although symbolically it certainly has, but economically and so on, not much has changed. I think part of the answer has to be through working out your personal stuff and not making it all about the culture, on the one hand. On the other hand, activism, people getting together and confronting it as a social, political, and cultural question so that they're not isolated with it. Because when you look at the literature on stress, the major trigger of stress or lack of information, uncertainty, and loss of control. So that's why I think it takes a community response. And that's why I think that activism, in a healthy sense, positive activism, whatever form it takes, joining together with others, reduces isolation, which is another form of stress. So it's both individual work in a sense of becoming more self-expressed, and it has to be on some level community work, so that people can work together and recognize that they're not alone with this. So that sense of shame is gone. I don't know what else to say to that. And probably you've got as much to say as I do, but that's what I would say. Okay, well, I don't know which of my books are here for you to purchase. Is it When the Body Says No? Does anybody know?
Yeah.
When the Body Says
That
No?
one, and we have Hungry Ghosts.
Oh, you have some of my addiction book as well. Okay, so those of you that wish to, you have a book on ADD as well, great. So those of you that wish to purchase and have them sign, I'm happy to do it. Otherwise, and in any case, thanks a lot for your attention.